Good morning, everyone. Today I will be presenting on Testo Junkie, Professor Paul Preciado's brilliant work on sites of radical enfleshment, the pharmacopornographic industry, and the use of testosterone for gender hacking. Now, my own research is focused on the application of political theory to reading queer performances, specifically the ontological embodiments, technological mediations, and acts of radical sexual enfleshment staged under the regulatory apparatus of the nation-state. In other words, the political performance of how bodies are produced, controlled, choreographed, and disposed of under late-stage capitalism. As such, this text just so happens to be directly addressing my own theoretical preoccupations, and I hope you will all find it as exhilarating as I did. Now, fair warning, in the interest of facilitating best practices in Zoom pedagogy, I will be prompting several moments of engagement in the chat box, so I hope that space will be generative as well. Now, a brief note on pronouns. When this article was published, the author was using female-coded pronouns, but now uses male. As such, those are the pronouns I will be using to reference Professor Preciado throughout this presentation. Now, let's explore the body as a living political archive together. This essay is from Professor Paul Preciado's book, Testo Junkie, a self-described body essay theorizing on notions of embodiment under the pharmacopornographic capitalism. This auto theory is juxtaposing the shadow capitalist industries of pornographic production and illicit drugs as sites of generative acts of enfleshment, challenging and reinforcing the prescriptive sexual codes of the neoliberal nation-state. All of this against a backdrop of Preciado's own engagement with these sites. In the chapter we read today, of course, he's linking the masturbatory and the toxicological, specifically within a technological apparatus. So, what exactly does this mean? What is the pharmacopornographic, and what does porn have to do with technological mediations? Well, not exactly, although that is, of course, relevant as well. Instead, we're looking at porn as a masturbatory virtual device with also this element of the spectacle. Its goal is overall worldwide masturbation. However, under this specific late capitalist industry, that pharmacopornographic in and of itself becomes a producer of capital. In this configuration, use of Derrida's definition of the pharmacon is of central importance also for Preciado's political practice, as it locates body modification through self-administered hormonal therapies as part of a range of practices that modify the metabolism of the cells on which they work. This is setting Preciado's political performance in a continuum of technological encounters which include drugs that transform the body, such as birth control, Viagra, performance-enhancing drugs, Prozac, and estrogen, and that archive of acts which code and uncode prescribed embodiments. In order to underline how radically transformative such configurations are, take a moment to hop on over to the chat box, if you will. Use these prompts as open-ended questions. Cast your mind back just to the start of today, which I realized for some of us might have been dashing out of bed at 9:25. Consider the encounters your body has already endured by interfacing with biochemical metabolites. How have such encounters modified your very self already? Did you sip on some sweetened stimulants in the form of caffeine, or maybe spray on some perfume? Did you roll on some aluminum zirconium tetrahydride, or swish some fluoride? Moving on to your environments. Where does biochemical intervention occur? Explicitly in the air purification system, or Purells now stocked on every surface, or maybe in more subtle ways. Most importantly, how do such types form our bodies along specifically sexual, racialized lines of subjectivity? How do our environments, how do these biochemical interactions call and shape our very bodies into patterns, into ways of being. How do they hail us? All of these encounters are ripe with effective resources, but setting them in a continuum with the biochemical act of the proliferation of potentialities such sites provide to resisting the inscription of subjectification interpolated by the seduction of the state. Furthermore, it sets the acts of transitioning into that continuum of body practices, molecular manipulations that we perform each and every day. Although we might not all be injecting testosterone or, of course, having our bodies produce it naturally, we are likely ingesting other forms of biochemical manipulators. This theorizing, therefore, is removing the transitioning and gender non-conforming body from the space of exception, a move which has profound effects on conceptualizations of the human. So, as we move through this text, keep those sites of biochemical interactions in mind and consider how such encounters are also subjectivizing, individuating, and interpolating our bodies into socially likable subjects in the pharmacopornographic economy. Of course, amongst all these, we are specifically looking at performance, which is why these sites are so important for mining for our own theoretical praxis. Not only is porn part of this pharmacopornographic industry, but it's also performance. Not just performative, but it also has this dramatic presence and a liberatory agenda from the multiple sex fictions that are created. This is overall not only an aesthetic and political strategy that has profound effects, not only for the modes in which we are interpolated, but as mentioned, the very conceptualizations of the human itself. With the archive curated by this theorizing, the plane which cuts, to borrow Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, is an embodied gender hacking, hacktivist of the self, if you will, which challenges the hailing of the nation-state sexual regulatory apparatus, resisting the interpolation of individuation along legible lines. So he's engaging with such body modification, not modulated through the prism of medical motivation or a very strict state-sanctioned apparatus, but rather explicitly to hack gender and radically reformulate the terms of embodiment prescribed by the social state. It's undoing gender by subverting it through the very mechanizations of its own production. This embodiment practice directly answers Deleuze and Guattari's call to make a body in a very explicit modality, reconfiguring the organization of gender markers inscribed in flesh. Doing so, he's not only marking an embodied sovereignty of the self, let's return to this later in regards to the collective, but destabilized the supremacy of chemical reactions which render the body legible to state-sanctioned sexual regulation. In AFAB bodies, these chemicals flooding the cells are conceptualized in one of two ways, as either the appropriate affirmation of the subject's gender identity, or the inverse, the performative wrong body discourse indiscriminately slapped on to the exquisite diversity of embodied expressions under the trans umbrella. Preciado takes these prescriptions and hacks them, mining biochemical resources for creative political enfleshments, refusing the legal and medical protocol. In doing so, it's explicitly addressing the pornification of labor, acting out explicit labor productions. Here we see a link to labor theory with the three domains of sexual production reconfigured as central to state processing of labor. Of course, sex work is work, and by integrating and explicating this, we are deconstructing the fabricated separation between the sexual and non-sexual labor. This rethinks labor in the 21st century and expands the notion of feminized labor, instead utilizing the category to refer to the sexual reproductive uber material work performed by the bodies of the sexually racially marked in the pharmacopornographic economic imaginary. This is very much expanding Marx's non-productive production concept, cites when production is inseparable from the act of producing, So there isn't any sort of explicit product that is produced from this labor, but rather it is the labor itself that is the site of capital creation. It's this complete reconfiguration of sites of the sexual within capitalism, which radically reformulates the overall market logics that we live under. This is overall confounding ontologies, creating ontologies which confound the logic of commodity and reconstruct space and contact. In other words, to use the example in the text, we are getting into bed with Hilton. Here we see the capital of celebrity as an ideal site of the conflation of all these different theoretical trends. So the practice of this individual being uber-sexualized, creating all this capital from their very acts of being, is an explicit part of the pharmacopornographic industry. The text defines this as Hilton transforming herself into a high-tech pharmacopornographic sex worker, explicitly addressing how the construction of bodies under capitalism is performed. Now, I wanted here to also interject some examples of sites that are explicitly engaging with the pharmacopornographic industry. So maybe these would have been explicit sex workers or explicit sites of sexual labor. However, ironically enough, I am working on my work laptop, which is the only one that I have. And it actually blocked me, unsurprisingly, from looking up pharmacy porn. This inadvertently creates a very interesting entry into the archive the archive that we are interrogating today. After all, my work is interpolating me into a very specific mode of worker. It's controlling and surveilling the labor that I perform, even in my own private and academic life. So we see here that all the different theoretical trends that are enacted in our world today are highly relevant for the work that this text is doing. And the ways that that normative work structure is created, the feminization of labor, all these different high-tech sex workers are absolutely essential for the sustaining of our normative modes of being. So the modification and modulation that is performed in this text is a form of gender terrorizing that desolates the regulators of desired subjectivity. This is really important as the normativizing force of the cis heterosexual nuclear family is itself sustained by the pharmacopornographic technological industry. While the advent of reproductive technologies have explicated this interdependence, the structure has always been there, with the bodies of the whore, abortionist, raped, barren, scientific subject, and other discarded manifestations constructing its silent edifice. So the technologies that actually interfere with the management of reproduction of sexuality are very politically charged because they are directly modifying the normative force of the family, the nuclear family, that is the foundation of the nation state. In other words, these sites of gender terrorism, these engagements with the pharmacopornographic sexual economies and industries are actually deconstructing the very normative force of the nation state that constructs our very ways of being. It deconstructs the human, it deconstructs subjectivity, it deconstructs normative modes of interpolation and individuation. It's really a very radical text. But these technologies, as we see, can be mined for liberatory potential, but also for very regressive agendas. And that leads us to consider exactly what is occurring today. When individuals who are gendered male at birth can completely modify their bodies, when we can play with gender, when we can dress up in ways that the pharma pornographic industry might not be able to interpolate. What does that do to our notions of the nation state? What does that do to our normative constructions of femininity and masculinity? What sites of generative potentiality are created? All these are really interesting questions that are of the utmost importance to our conceptions of the human, to our existence under the nation state, and our challenges to that constructed edifice. So ultimately, it's not just a mediation on the cinematic reproduction of sexual stimuli, but rather an entire theorizing on the construction of labor in the 21st century that controls political subjectivity. Really? This is a mediation of the very nature of power itself, biological, technosexual, and always pharmapornographic.